If I could choose just a single element of the traditional teachings that we're called to pick up, it would be the teachings of the honorable harvest, which were taught us by the plants, who give us everything that we need. It's a covenant of reciprocity between humans and the living world, a very sophisticated ethical protocol. One of the first steps of the honorable harvest is to understand that the lives that we are taking are the lives of generous beings, of sovereign beings. And in order to accept their gift, we owe them at least our attention. To care for them, we must know what they need. And at the very minimum, we should know their names. And yet, the average American can name over 100 corporate logos and 10 plants. Is it a surprise that we have accepted a political system that grants personhood to corporations and no status at all for wild rice and redwoods? The protocols for the honorable harvest are not really written down, but if they were, it would look something like this. When you get to the woods, you don't just start grabbing everything in sight. We're taught never to take the first plant that you see, and that means you'll never take the last. This is a prescription with inherent conservation value. And then if we encounter another plant, we ask permission. I've always been taught to address that plant, to introduce myself and tell it what it is that I have come for. If you're going to take a life, you have to be personally accountable for it. I know there are places where if you talk to a plant, they think you are crazy, but in our way, it's just good manners. If you're going to ask, you have to listen for the answer. You can listen in different ways, pragmatically, intuitively. Look around, see whether those plants have enough to share. And if the answer is no, you go home. For we remember that they don't belong to us. And taking without permission is also known as stealing. And the Honorable Harvest counsels that we also take in such a way that does the least harm and in a way that benefits the growth of the plant. Use everything that you take. It's disrespectful of the life that's given to waste it. The next tenet of the honorable harvest is to share it with others, human and non. The earth has shared generously with us, so we have to model that behavior in return. And a culture of sharing, we know, is a culture of resilience. Plant gatherers often leave a spiritual gift behind, but it can also be a material gift. Weeding, caretaking, spreading seeds, helping those plants to flourish. We give songs, we give ceremony, we give our respect, we give fertilizer. Every breath that you take is a breath that was made for you by plants. On the water that you drink, whether you're in an urban setting, whether you're on a remote mountaintop, we still are recipients of those gifts. And if we take the time to be grateful, that brings us into that state of humility, of understanding that we are not at the top of a biological hierarchy, that in fact we are the younger brothers of creation.
Greetings, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Tots Kalat, or good evening in Nesbers. And I'm very happy to see all of you joining us this evening. Um, Before we get started, I want to give an Indigenous land acknowledgement. And as folks are entering into the chat, their name and where they're hailing from, I think we can see that we have folks from what's now known as Oregon, Washington, California, Illinois, New York, and Robin's coming from Onondaga lands in upstate New York. So a land acknowledgement really acknowledges that these are all Indigenous lands. And a big piece of that land acknowledgement is not only to recognize ancestors who walk and once walked on the lands, but also kind of rules of engagement, or how to engage with the land and really how to care for it. And this will kind of be a theme throughout this evening. And a land acknowledgement is a big first step in circling around and prioritizing Native voices and recognition towards reconciliation and ultimately land back. So good evening. My name is Gabe Shoeships. I am from the group, the Friends of Tryon Creek. I will be moderating tonight's event. And thank you for joining us. We've had an amazing turnout, and because of our large audience here, we have pre-selected questions that I will read during Robin's Q&A. And before I introduce Dr. Kimmerer, I want to thank our partners and sponsors for this event. It was a collaborative group effort to make this evening with Robin happen. As I mentioned, I'm from the Friends of Tryon Creek. We are one of 3 partners who work to make this happen. We are a community-focused organization whose mission is to work in partnership with Oregon State Parks to inspire and nurture relationships with nature in our unique urban forest. So also the Confluence Project. Confluence connects you to the history, living cultures, and ecology of the Columbia River system through Indigenous voices. Confluence is a community-supported nonprofit that works through 6 art landscapes, educational programs, and public gatherings in collaboration with Northwest tribes, communities, and the celebrated artist Maya Lin. And also the Cottonwood School of Civics and Science. And their mission is to provide a creative learning environment where students develop a deep sense of place and belonging and work to become engaged stewards of the natural world around them and active citizens within our community. We also want to thank the Multnomah County Library, which is the primary library system that serves the city of Portland. And also we have wonderful sponsors that came together to make this happen, including the Gray Family Foundation, the Columbia Land Trust, the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts, Oregon's Metro Organization, the Oregon Cultural Trust, and the High Desert Museum. So thank you all. And thinking about our evening with Dr. Kimmerer, and I'm going to let Robin introduce herself, but I want to just recognize where we're at, and we're going to really be thinking about kind of the focus of our talk is decolonizing education. So we're going to take a moment to think about, really what we're decolonizing from, and how to get back to a place of reconciliation and reclamation. Excuse me. So with that said, I am going to pass this over to Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, who will introduce herself and then share with us her words, and then we will have time for a Q&A where we will share selected questions. So as you arrive and enter the chat, please enter your name and where you're hailing from, and even better, maybe the indigenous lands that you are walking on now. So with that said, I'd like to welcome Robin Wall Kimmerer. Welcome, Robin.
Miigwech, Gabe. Miigwech for that very nice introduction. And I'm so glad to be, in a sense, back in Oregon, one of my favorite places on the planet. And so I'm glad to be with you all. I'm going to begin with our traditional protocol greeting in Potawatomi language and say to you, Bonjour, Jayak. Hello, everybody. Respectful greetings. Shabadaske gish kokwe nadeshnakas. Bodwe wad mi kwenda. Megazedo dem minwa makoto dem. Syracuse, New York, Nidoch Bia. Miigwech Kinagego Gami Zhang. And in our beautiful language, I've told you that my name is Light Shining Through Sky Woman. I'm a member of the Potawatomi Nation, Anishinaabe peoples of the Great Lakes. I am of the Bear Clan, also of the Eagles. I am living here near Syracuse, New York, where winter has come today. We have our first good snow on the ground to welcome that season. And I want to share my screen because in this time we are all spending so much time looking at our screens. I want to invite in some of our other beings from the land to join us here. So hold on a second while I do that. Oh goodness, where did it go? There had to be some kind of glitch. Hold on here. Oh goodness. I'm really sorry to delay you, but my slides seem to have vanished. Oh, good. Okay, hold on. I'm going to have to go find them again. Oh, dear. We were hoping that the snow wouldn't cause a power outage or anything else like that. And so the only glitch is that my slides disappeared, and I hope they'll come right back. There we go. Okay, can you all see? I bet you can. Okay, great. It is also part of our Potawatomi protocol that we remember that our first responsibilities are for gratitude. And so if we think about the fact that this morning when we first put our feet on Shkokmikwe, that we had everything that we needed. We had air to breathe. We had that first drink of cool water. We had food to eat. We had the companionship of clouds and cedars and perhaps geese in the air where you are. We had the companionship of our friends and families. We had the privilege of our good work together. And I am especially grateful for the experience of today to meet with all of the students this afternoon. And this reminds me that I want to also extend my gratitude to all teachers. There's such beautiful reciprocity between being a learner, a student, and being a teacher. But in this moment in particular, when our teachers are on the front lines, I want to give a special gratitude to all teachers, not only teachers in the classroom, but teachers in our homes, teachers all over who are setting good examples and offering lessons. I also want to honor those teachers who are more than human, all of the plants and animals in water and land who are also our teachers, and the land as our first teacher. And as we give gratitude for all of the gifts that surround us, we also recognize that each of us is in some way tethered, really embedded in an economy and in institutions that relentlessly ask, what more can we take from the earth? And as we think about education and the questions that we ask of the world and of ourselves, let's turn that question on its head and say, what does the earth ask of us? Isn't that the question we need in this moment of impending climate chaos on the edge of the sixth extinction? I also want to say very honestly that I am unlikely to tell you anything tonight that you don't already know. But I'm remembering the teachings of our elders who say, but we're humans and we forget. And so our job is to remember to remember. And really, our theme tonight is as we remember, what do we have to unlearn? And what do we have to learn again? And I was given the charge to address that question of education, learning and unlearning, through a different lens than we might usually hear from. Another part of our being together, as Gabe suggested, is land acknowledgement. I want to tell you where I am tonight. When you look at this map, you might be thinking about national boundaries and state boundaries, but what you're looking at is long before that, when we're looking at the territories of the Haudenosaunee people. And I live right there south of Syracuse, quite near to Onondaga Nation.
Robin, I'm so sorry, but we can't see the slides. I'm really sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to let you know that people are saying that.
Slides look like they're
so
maybe to be shared again.
You don't see anything. Oh, here we are. Okay, let me see what we can do here. Oh, you must see these slides. Let me see.
We click share screen again because it's enabled. So
yeah.
There we go. Perfect.
You see them now? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
There we go.
Awesome. Okay. Hopefully, yeah. Okay. Good. Thanks for letting me know. All right. So again, you see, you don't just have to imagine that I live here in the ancestral territory of the Onondaga Nation, to whom we owe an unpaid debt of land, of history, and certainly of knowledge of our plant and animal communities and stewardship of how to care for those places. And part of our learning and unlearning is this notion of territorial acknowledgement. And that as we imagine starting our days in our classrooms with an acknowledgement of where we stand, not only where do we stand on the land, but where do we stand in relationship to history and doing right by land, beyond territorial acknowledgement into the practices that enact it, particularly as we think about education. I also want to say that in this beautiful territory where I live, which is mostly sugar maple forests and orchards and farms, I also live in a place where the gifts sit right next to wounds. And you're looking here at a photograph of the storied Onondaga Lake, the sacred territory of the Haudenosaunee, a sacred site for Onondaga people. And it is also the home of Superfund sites. It is a place where the Indigenous worldview has been literally buried by the industrial worldview. The place where the peacemaker walked is covered by many meters of industrial sludge. So our work through looking at the world through a different lens is to combat that burying not only of sacred land, but of sacred ways of knowing. And when we look at a place like Onondaga Lake, we can't help but recognize what a hard, hard place we are in right now. We are bearing witness to the outcomes of the way that we have been living here on Turtle Island for hundreds of years. And these words that, the ecosystem's ability to sustain future generations is in question. Well, truly, there's no question that it's not sustainable. And let's just take a minute because, again, as we're learning and unlearning through a different lens, what does that word sustainable even mean? And I am reminded of a story shared with me by Carol Crow, an Algonquin biologist who talked about wanting to go to a sustainability meeting and going to her tribal council asking for a travel grant to do that. And her elders said, well, tell us what this sustainability thing is. And so she said, well, that's the way we've been living on our land, living well on our land for millennia, since time immemorial. But she also gave them these definitions that are really familiar to all of us in the audience tonight. I'm not going to read them to you because you know them very well, but all these definitions of sustainability have in common this notion of continued provision into the future, that our actions do not abridge the capacity of the earth to regenerate what it is that humans need. And Carol says that she told all of this to her elders and they were very quiet. And in fact, she thought they were going to turn down her request. But what they said was, yes, go to that meeting. Go to that meeting and we want you to carry a message to the people gathered there. And that message is that their notion of so-called sustainability sounds like they're just trying to find a way to keep on taking. It's always just taking. And when our feet hit the ground in the morning, we should be thinking what it is that we can give. This frame shift of sustainability from the continuity of taking to the imperative of giving is an important reframing of what it means to be a human being in this world. It also reminds me, as I was telling the young people this morning when we first met, I remember sitting around a fire with a bunch of Potawatomi folks, and some of the older guys were really giving me a hard time because
After all, I had just earned my PhD in botany, and they were kind of teasing me for spending my life in school as well. They might comment on that. And they said, "So, what does it mean to be educated?" And so I talked about, learning to learn and creativity and wonder and problem solving, all those things that you might say as well. And they said, "Well, that's not quite how we would answer this question of what does it mean to be an educated person." What they said was, an educated person is somebody who knows their gifts. What are my gifts and how shall I give them to the world? That's what it means to be an educated person. And to all of you teachers and students as well out there, I think about the fact that, have I ever written a syllabus that has this as its primary learning goal? To know your gift and how to give them in the world. This is part of our work of decolonizing education, to guide education by this set of principles. That's really what we're going to focus on today. I want to tell you, though, because I especially know that lots of students are listening tonight, particularly Native students. So I want to tell you just a little bit about my own journey toward becoming an educated person, where this definition of education was rarely on the syllabus. It was fall time in September when I first went off to college. And, I was born a botanist, I really was. And so there was no question when I went away to college that I would study botany. And when I knew I was going to be one of the only women in the forestry school, and certainly the only Native student there. And so I wanted to be really well prepared for what I knew lay ahead. And so when my teacher gave me my freshman interview and said, "So, Miss Wall, why do you want to study botany?" I had my answer already, because these plants that you see here, the goldenrod and the asters, have always been so dear to me. And I said to him, "I want to know why goldenrod and asters grow together and look so beautiful together. They could grow apart, but they don't. They grow together, intermingled, and just make this gorgeous display." And I said, "Why is the world so beautiful?" And he said, "My dear, that is not a question of science. If you wanted to study beauty, you should have gone to art school." Like, oh, I was crushed. I thought it was a really good question. I thought it was a really good botany question, but apparently wasn't. And so I said, "Well, I also want to know why the plants make medicines. I want to know why some plants bend for baskets and others don't." And he looked at me and said, "Well, that's not science either. But come on, you come and take my classes and we'll teach you what plants are really all about." That's why I looked so happy a few hours later in my freshman photo. I had no vocabulary for resistance to what I had just encountered. I had unknowingly walked between worldviews, from an indigenous worldview of growing up on the land where the plants were my relatives, my teachers, my companions, and a question of why is the world so beautiful was the most important question, to a place where the questions that were asked of plants is, how does it work? And I felt really lost. In a way, my first day in higher education was not so unlike my grandfather's first day in education, because he, as a little boy, was taken from his family on our reservation in Oklahoma, put on a train for the Carlisle Indian School, where he too was told that everything that he knew about the world didn't matter, needed to be washed away and replaced with colonizer knowledge. And the echo of his day at school and my day of school propelled me forward in the world. And I'm remembering that what I encountered in going into science, into higher education in science, was something of an intellectual monoculture. I felt as if I was knocking at the door of a big fortress on the hill, and it was hard to get in, maybe hard to get out. It was all regimented knowledge where I had to set aside the knowledge that I had of the land and of plants in order to enter there. What saved me, of course, were the plants. That I so loved botany and wanted to know everything there was about plants. And so I eagerly learned whatever they had to teach me inside that fortress, but all the while knowing that I was leaving something really precious behind that there was no room for in that realm of education. So I am so proud to tell you that right down the hall from that place where I was told that that's not science and that your way of thinking does not belong here, we now have the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, whose mission is to bring together the great intellectual traditions of Indigenous knowledge and the tools of Western science for our shared concerns of care for Shkakmikwe, for Mother Earth. And I tell you this story because we are all in this moment thinking about this learning and unlearning. How is it we might do education from a different lens? How might we decolonize our educational processes and assumptions so that we come to a place of becoming educated people who know their gifts and how to give them to the earth? Rather than the fortress, this intellectual monoculture, the work we try to do at the center is governed by a different metaphor, an organic metaphor of the garden. What we're really trying to do is to cultivate a mutualism between knowledge systems, not just one, but many ways of knowing, because we want to create a welcoming, inclusive educational environment to remember that we know so much more together than any of us do alone. And so the garden metaphor that we use is actually taken from the genius of Indigenous science, the Three Sisters polyculture, where, as you probably know, corn, beans, and squash are not grown in a monoculture, but grown together in companionship, in relationship. The corn supports the beans fertilize the corn, and the squash shades the ground. They all work together. And when you plant those three species together, they're more productive, more nutritious, and better for the land than any of them grown apart. Could we learn from this plant symbiosis mutualistic model about planting a knowledge garden? That's the approach we're taking so that all can be fed. Oftentimes, when we think about incorporation of traditional ecological knowledge or Indigenous knowledge into STEM curricula, sometimes it's tucked in around the edges. Mostly it's not there at all, it's erased, but sometimes it's tucked in around the edges. But in our model, it is not tucked in, it is the center of the metaphor. It is the intellectual scaffolding for all that follows. Corn, as emblematic of Indigenous knowledge, or TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, is the elder knowledge. It's the ancient knowledge. It's the holistic knowledge, which includes mind, body, emotion, and spirit. So we plant it first and we honor it first in our knowledge garden that rises out of the earth. So the corn becomes our structure of TEK. As a scientist, I tend to think about the beans as akin to scientific knowledge, very powerful, curious, always wandering. They can enrich this symbiosis. But if beans are the only thing you plant in your garden, they'll take over, right? They crawl all over everything. They're not guided in any way. Productivity is lost, and any other plants in the garden become subsumed by the presence of those beans. I think that can be a little bit like science too, in creating a monoculture of knowledge. And so the metaphor that we like to use is to thinking about beings as Western science guided by the presence of the corn. And when that bean vine climbs the corn plant, as you know, if you've ever grown it like this, the beans flower in between the leaves of the corn. They're guided, their flowering is guided by these principles of indigenous knowledge that we think of in this knowledge garden as at least what a lot of us call the 5 R's of indigenous philosophy of respect, relationship, responsibility, reciprocity, and reverence. What would it look like if the tools of Western science, which are today deliberately unconstrained by human values, what if they were guided by these values? What would that look like as we turn the tools of Western science to caring for Mother Earth, if this was the framework that we used? And then, of course, there's the squash. The squash that sits at the bottom of the corn and the beans shades the soil, keeps it moist, keeps it cool, keeps the weeds down. The squash are creating the climate, the microclimate where beans and corn can grow together. So in our knowledge metaphor, this is our educational space. How do we as educators, how do we as citizens create a climate where multiple ways of knowing are welcomed and embraced because of the way that they will enrich the solutions that we might find? So this knowledge garden acknowledges that the land is the source of knowledge. In our language, our word for knowledge and for teacher comes from this word kenamagwin, which actually invokes the earth as the holder of knowledge. And in that, we plant as our scaffold traditional ecological knowledge to guide scientific knowledge and create this ethical space of engagement where they can meet. We also acknowledge it. My fingers were too fast there. We also acknowledge there's a fourth sister. The fourth sister, the one who tills the ground, the one who harvests the seed, who saves the seed, who plants the seed. That's us, right? The gardeners of this knowledge garden, that we have responsibility for this symbiosis to nurture its development, to share its harvest. And how do we tend that garden? There's so much to say about that. I'll just a tiny little bit here. How do we tend this garden? Let me start by saying that I don't have a slide for how do we tend the Western Science Garden. That has been tended in educational institutions for hundreds of years. But as we bring forward this decolonizing notion of bringing Indigenous knowledge to our classrooms, how do we tend that part of our garden? We promote language revitalization, our precious ideas and language of Indigenous languages to breathe life into them again and have them present in our classrooms. We foster respect for Indigenous sovereignty. We act beyond territorial acknowledgement to truly respect and protect sovereignty. We protect cultural landscapes that provide for the flourishing of land and people. We think about education for community priorities, not knowledge for knowledge's sake, but knowledge for care's sake. And so what we're doing here really is in envisioning this symbiosis of scientific knowledge in partnership with traditional knowledge, so all are fed. One of the important things that I want to emphasize about this Three Sisters Garden is that the three species remain distinct. They are sovereign species. The corn doesn't try to become the bean doesn't become the squash. There's no blending here. There's complementarity among three beings that have their own integrity, their own sovereignty, and so all are fed. Another way of framing this three sisters metaphor that perhaps you have heard about is this notion of two-eyed seeing. Again, when I was asked to talk about how might education look through a different lens, we can think about it in the lenses of our eyes, right? Of two-eyed seeing. We know that each one of our eyes actually sees something different, and then we reconcile it and make meaning in our brains. Can we do that? To acknowledge that there are at least two lenses to look at the world, and can we see with both of those eyes, Western science and Indigenous science? Can we train ourselves to become bilingual, bivisual? And learning in this way requires honoring all of the human gifts for understanding, for knowledge generation. In the medicine wheel of Anishinaabe Potawatomi people, we recognize that the whole of a human being in that circle has at least four ways of understanding the world: of body, mind, spirit, and emotion. They're all gifts of understanding. But in Western science and in much of Western education, we privilege this knowledge right here. We privilege the intellect. So much of our training goes right here. And to some extent, that which we can observe and sense and measure. But in Western STEM education, spirit and emotion are excluded from our learning. How will we know what are our gifts and how to give them in the world if we're only using half of our ways of knowing? Decolonizing education, science education, is a matter of opening ourselves to these full panorama of ways of knowing so that we have all of them. Western science is, in a sense, a subset of Indigenous science. What would it look like to apply these bigger lenses to our questions of earth care? Let's start with this question about what does land mean? When I went away to college and studied conservation and natural resource management, what I learned was that land is natural resources. They're almost synonymous with one another in that Western knowledge framework. Land is also understood as capital, right? Because we often have Western science coupled to our the dominant economic system. Land is understood as property, isn't it? That is almost one of the first meanings of land, as a place for which people claim rights, the property rights. And sometimes we think about land as a source of ecosystem services, those things which allow life to flourish on the planet. Things like water purification, soil building, and little things like oxygen generation. Through the Western lens and through the lens of much of Western science education, this is what land means. But what if we used that other lens? What if we used the lens of Indigenous ways of knowing? What if we planted corn at the center of our knowledge garden? What might we think and learn about what land means? Could we unlearn some of this settler view of what land is? And remember that land in the Indigenous worldview is a source of identity. People's beings are inseparable. Indigenous people's beings are inseparable from their lands. Certainly land as our sustainer, the ones who take care of us. Land as home, not only for people, but for our more than human relatives as well. All of the bugs and birds and fish and trees and mosses and flowers, it's their home too. Land understood as a connection over time to our ancestors and to our descendants. Their presence is living in the land. And it is out of the land that our descendants look to us for their lives. Land as our library, land quite literally as the teacher, the source of our knowledge. Land as our healer, it's the pharmacy, both biophysical and spiritual, because the land is inspirited, because the land is our home, because we claim and think about land not as a place for which we claim rights, but as a place for which we have responsibility. Moral responsibility. Land is the place we enact responsibility for life because land is sacred. This is decolonizing ecology education, decolonizing environmental education, to think about land in this multifaceted way of mind, body, emotion, and spirit. And how we speak about this really matters. We started off our time together this evening thinking about the gifts that shower us from Shkak from Mother Earth. And yet we call those gifts natural resources. Language matters, words matter. When we teach our students and ourselves, learning and unlearning, are these natural resources or are they gifts? If you worked in the Department of Earthly Gifts, as opposed to the Department of Natural Resources, wouldn't your job be different? Wouldn't you feel differently about it? Wouldn't you behave differently? Words matter. These two lenses of looking at land really pose this question for us of, is land merely a source of belongings, or can it be our most profound source of belonging, and indeed the common ground that we long for? I want to invoke, on an evening devoted to education, learning, and unlearning, the words of Faithkeeper Oren Lyons of Onondaga Nation, who has been a wonderful mentor and teacher to me, and to so many others all over the globe for the last 90 years. He's 90 this year. When he was asked, after a lifetime of doing work in environmental education, environmental philosophy, when he was asked, what is it that we need to do to turn away from the destructive path that we are on? He said it really boils down to 4 words: values change for survival. It isn't that we need more data. We don't need more policy. We don't need more technology. All of those things are valuable and will contribute to a revolution towards sustainability, real sustainability. But what he said we need is values change. And Western science alone explicitly excludes values. So it can't be the only tool that we use in thinking about sustainability. Values change for survival. Oftentimes in our educational systems, the values that we impart in science education are critical ones. If we look on the left, implicitly, look at this pyramid with human people on top of some ecological, biological, ethical pyramid, right? This is the model of human exceptionalism, that humans are somehow different and better than and more deserving of the riches of and the teachings of the world than anybody else. And if you notice, it's some kinds of humans that are at the top of that pyramid. This worldview of human exceptionalism is, to me, at the root of our exploitative, dominant economies that lead to so much injustice and suffering. The values change for survival we might see in the paired diagram of the circle, where we're all relatives. We're all relatives. Every species has their role, their gift, their responsibilities in the world. This is a kind of economy that leads to regeneration rather than exploitation. It reminds us that all flourishing is mutual. Are we educating for the Anthropocene or the Symbiocene? That term, the Anthropocene, to acknowledge that we are living in a world dominated by humans. I prefer the language of the Symbiocene, that we are entering into a time when symbiosis among all beings, and indeed among all knowledges, is what will create a green pathway for us. Are we going to persist in the learning that we as humans are basically consumers? We're so often referred to as consumers rather than citizens. Is that all we are? Are we educating our young people to be members of an extractive economy or a regenerative economy? That's part of decolonizing education too. Another element of decolonizing education is, who do we consider to be the teacher? That authority standing up in front of the room, who is a human, who is an individual in only one species? Are we in STEM learning about the land and missing the opportunity to learn from the land, to consider the land as teacher? And learning from the land requires that you be on the land, that you be in the presence of the teacher. It requires forming relationships with other beings born of attention, respect, reciprocity. Learning from the land requires cultivating certain qualities of perception, learning how to be still, learning how to look, learning how to listen with more than your ears. It requires humility, the humility to know that we can learn from intelligences other than our own. This is a hallmark of that other lens on education, that there are other beings out there who are our teachers, other beings who can help us solve problems and guide us to the future. And in Potawatomi ways of knowing, we call the plants our teachers. Not only are they beings, but they are in persons, but they are our oldest teachers. And when you think about it, they unite earth and sky, light and dark. Who else has the capacity to turn light and air and water into food and give it away, to turn it into medicine and give it away? They are our teachers of generosity. They're teachers of sharing the gift. We could do worse than listening to plants as our teachers. And if plants are our teachers, the question then becomes, how can we be better students? We know that as a society, we have actually been diagnosed with what conservation biologists and others call plant blindness. That not only do we disregard plants and think of them as at the bottom of a hierarchy rather than our esteemed teachers, but our conservation dollars, our science dollars, our research and teaching efforts are for the most part directed toward animals and not to plants. And this too is part of our work in shifting the lens toward those other beings who sustain us. If plants are our teachers, how do we be better students? Certainly by paying attention. By paying attention in the familiar ways and in the unfamiliar ways, by cultivating these qualities of perception, of humility and deep learning and deep listening to the beings who are around us. Paying attention, we not only have to pay attention to the beauty of a camas meadow, but we have to pay attention to the wounds of the world as well, to the clear cut as well. We will pay attention to the beautiful peaks, but we also have to pay attention to the open pit mine, because attention focuses us in a way that creates intention. And intention is what leads to action. Paying attention is a sacred act. Attention also often means that we pay attention and learn names. And it's not just because I'm a botanist that I think we all ought to learn names. I don't care what names you learn, but that you recognize our neighbors, our companions on this planet, indeed, our relatives and our teachers. If you were going to learn any one plant, this might be a good one to learn the name. This is a plant known as Heal All. A good one to begin with, and it probably grows in your backyard at this exact moment. Why is knowing names important? Not only because it brings you into relationship with the living world, but the truth of the matter is that the world seems less like a shopping bag full of commodities, or a warehouse full of stuff, that exploitative worldview again. It feels more like a community, more like a family, when we've taken the time to learn their names. Educational psychologists have told us this now well-known fact that the average American school child recognizes 100 corporate logos and only 10 plants. Our attention has been hijacked, and it's time we reclaim it toward those beings who really sustain us. And when we are learning about the world and from the world, we can remember again multiple ways of learning. You know, when we think about plant names, here's Linnaeus, who we're all taught is the father of plant taxonomy, of plant naming, the one who created the system of binomial nomenclature to put scientific Latinized names on all of the plants of the world. Worthy work. The father of taxonomy, before the mid-1700s, people didn't name plants? Of course they did. Of course there was taxonomy long before that. On the right side of your screen, you're looking at Nana Bourgeot, who in the Potawatomi tradition is our great namer, our Linnaeus, if you will. But he didn't just stamp a name in a foreign language on other beings as if they were things, as if they were specimens. We're told that Nana Bourgeot learned the names of the plants by getting to know them so well that they revealed their own names to him. A different lens on learning and naming and relating to the world, a way that we can unlearn, a way that we can decolonize education by learning from the land, not just about the land. If we are to change this trajectory of sustainability that we began with at the top of this hour, I think the education shift that we need, additional shift among the many I've mentioned already, is this notion that in science education, in environmental education, can we be educating for the qualities of empathy and agency? Can we create systems that generate ecological compassion for the living world and generate in our students and in ourselves a sense of agency, that we have the ability to answer that question of what does the earth ask of us, that we can be givers to the earth, not just passive takers. What is it? What are some of the tools that we have to educate for empathy and for agency? What does the earth ask of us? One of the important answers there is gratitude. And again, let me say, as I did at the outset, that in my culture, which is a culture of gratitude, we say this is our first responsibility, to give gratitude to those beings whose lives support our own. This is a teaching of value and reciprocity as we also learn our ecological environmental sciences. We learn what does it mean to be grateful for them, because when I'm eating that apple, the offspring of that apple tree is now in my mouth. The gratitude that we feel to each of these beings because they have given us their gifts. It creates a culture of interdependence. We also know that cultures of gratitude, by and large, the practice of radical gratitude is transformative because cultures of gratitude create an ethic of sufficiency, of enoughness. Practice of gratitude and recognition of the beings who support your life reminds you that you have everything that you need. And it puts the brakes on this endless consumption that our economy calls us toward. And so practice of gratitude and contentment can be a radical act when economies are constantly telling us we don't have enough and that we should consume more. Gratitude is also powerful in creating both empathy and agency because gratitude opens the door to reciprocity. We know this as human people, right? When somebody gives us a gift, we know what we want to do. We want to give a great gift back in addition to saying thank you. Gratitude compels reciprocity. And how do we reciprocate the gifts of the earth? How can we as human people give back rather than accepting this colonial notion that humans and nature are a bad mix and ought to be kept apart? The earth calls us to reciprocity, and it brings us back to that question of what does it mean to be an educated person? An educated person who knows their gift and how to give it in the world is someone capable of reciprocity and the joy and the justice that follows from that. How do we do this? The list is long. Let me just touch on a couple more before we close this evening. One of the most powerful forms of agency and empathy that we can educate ourselves for is restoration, is healing. Shovels and seeds and plants in the ground. I think about ecosystem restoration as doing dishes in Mother Earth's kitchen. We have had this feast. We have had this feast of all of the gifts of the earth, and we've made a mess. And now it's time to clean it up. It's our responsibility as well as our gift to do that. And I've worked in ecosystem restoration for some time now, and now in reciprocal restoration. And in this work, I've come to understand that it's not just the land that's broken. It's our relationship to land that's broken. Onondaga Lake, a sacred lake filled with mercury, that's broken, but it is evidence of a broken relationship with land. So our work as educators, as learners, is not only to heal the land, but to heal our relationship with land as well. And restoration of relationship is not what Western science is good at. Explicitly not, because it sets aside values very explicitly. So in order to restore both land and relationship to land, we need a symbiosis between ways of knowing. And traditional ecological knowledge is rich in prescriptions of how we care for the land, of how human people can be givers to the land, so much so that we think that human people can be medicine for the land, as opposed to the Western notion of being a plague on the land. What does the earth ask of us? Respect. One of those 5 R's. There's a lot of ways to think about that. But one of the important elements as we think about, again, learning and unlearning and decolonizing science education in particular, is that in Western ways of knowing, we value in the scientific community, knowledge for knowledge's sake. We call it pure research, right? And it is held up as a great good. And indeed, many times it is. But it is unencumbered by responsibility. In Western science, we separate the observer and the observed. We set aside values for knowledge. In Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous ways of teaching and learning, that's not possible. Knowledge and responsibility are inextricably linked. In fact, many Indigenous teachers will not impart or share knowledge until they have taught responsibility. When I teach my classes and the students all want to know, oh, can we pick that? Can we eat that? Let's go harvest it. We don't begin there. We begin with responsibility and later with the knowledge of the gifts of those plants. The honorable harvest is now, I know many of you are part of the groups that have been reading Braiding Sweetgrass, so you're familiar with these ideas that when we take from the land this coupling of knowledge and responsibility, we have a responsibility to harvest honorably from the land, of using self-restraint, never take the first one, ask permission to take those things. Listen for the answer. Do these plants and animals have enough to share? Take only what you need, use everything that you take. Minimize harm in the way that one takes. Offer gratitude. Share everything that you've taken, reciprocate the gift, and take only that which has been given to us. The honorable harvest is a set of Indigenous protocols for how we take from the world. It doesn't say that we don't take. We have to. We're animals. We can't photosynthesize. But the way that we take with respect is to engage the rest of the living world as our family, as persons, as teachers, not as things, not as a warehouse full of commodities, but our family, and treat them thusly. To finish up, I'm just going to scoot ahead a little bit here. One of the other elements of decolonizing our science education has to do with decolonizing our language. And briefly, I want to share a reflection on a certain kind of linguistic imperialism that comes with speaking English. English, which is now the dominant language of Turtle Island here. If we look at these beings who we thanked at the beginning of this hour together, in English, the only way we have to refer to those beings is as it, right? It, monarch butterfly, the robin, the bloodroot, the maple, the moon. In English, we say, it's out there, you know? We it the world. We would never it one another, right? Would we ever say of your grandmother, oh, it's standing in the kitchen, it's making cookies? We would dehumanize her. We would make her into an object. We would disrespect her by calling her it. And yet we refer to our beloved grandmother Earth in just that way. And itting the world is a kind of permission for the exploitative, unsustainable economies that enmesh us. And in Potawatomi language, it's impossible to speak of the living world as it. That's why I mean it's linguistic imperialism, replacing one language with another, one set of meanings with the other. Land as natural resources versus land as home. Land as property versus land as identity, the home of our relatives. This itting of the world, profoundly dishonorable. And so might we engage with Indigenous languages as we decolonize education to think about learning the grammar of animacy, Might we in English use new words so that we don't have to it the world, so that we don't have to objectify the world and exclude them from our circle of ethics? These new pronouns could look something like this. In our language, in Potawatomi, we have a word which is Bamadazi Aki, which just means an earth being, one being of the living earth. We can't really slide that word into English, can we? That wouldn't work very well. But there's the word Aki, which means the earth at the end of that word. And at the end of Aki, there's the word ki. Might we consider using the pronoun ki next to he, she, ki, and it, so that we no longer have to say it of the leader of the tree world, the sugar maples. We can speak of them as a being, as a respectfully as a being. And then we need a word that is plural. And we already have that in English. We'll just add an N, so that when we speak of the living world, we use the pronoun kin. We see those geese and we say kin are flying south for the winter. Have a good trip. Come back soon. So that we replace our language of objectification with one of relationship, respect, reciprocity, and reverence. What does the earth ask of us? Justice. Justice and respect for all living beings. And I would close with the words of one of my teachers, the late Audrey Shenandoah, who said, "Our work as humans is to seek justice. Not only justice for ourselves, but justice for all creation." Mi'u, miigwech. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. I think I would feel comfortable speaking for our large group and saying, thank you so much for your beautiful words. You know, they really have a way of connecting and moving across communities. And really, what I hear is a call to action. It really seems the time that the earth is calling to us and is checking its relationship with us. So on behalf of our large audience that gathered here today, and in our Indigenous traditions, your time and your words are the ultimate gift. So right now, we're going to seg into a question and answer session with Robin. And because of our large interest, we went in and selected a few questions for Robin tonight. And,
only easy ones, right?
Only easy ones. and something that really showed up to me was kind of reclaiming another relationship with the earth, with Turtle Island here, and really the leadership and those who lead the healing and the restoration of these lands, traditionally were women identified. And that really showed up in our questions, in our responses, in our interactions, and especially Black, Indigenous, and women of color. And out of a large collection of students, teachers, youth, elders, scientists, biologists, educators that have joined us tonight. So our first question has actually been submitted through video. So we're going to share our screen, and this is a question from Katie Young. So if we could share our screen and get it going.
Hi, Robin. Thank you so much for your time today. So my question is, what's your advice to young people like myself who grew up and currently live in very urban settings with little physical access to being in touch with their Indigenous heritage and culture? How can you start the journey to rebuild any lost connections with one's ancestry? Thank you.
Katie, you are, as you know, not alone in that journey, and that's one of the most important things to remember. I remember early in my path feeling that same way of disconnected, and one of the powerful ways home for me was reconnecting. Well, there's two things I want to say. First of all, reconnecting with land. That in the absence of elders and cultural teachings around you, you remember that the land is our teacher. And so you can go humbly and attentively to the land and learn so much, because she was the teacher of our ancestors. She is the teacher of our people. So reconnecting with the land is a powerful way to do that. But there's also the knowing. Well, that I like to think that the land knows us even when we're lost, is the way that I like to think about that. But also our ancestors and our families know us even when we're lost. I remember at one time being in touch with a distant family member in Oklahoma, and thinking that, you know, she would have no interest in this remote relative. And I told her just a little bit of my story, and she said, "Oh, you're Asa's granddaughter? We always wondered what happened to you. There were so many forces, right, that pulled us apart. In my grandfather's case, it was the boarding schools. And, you know, he was taken from them, but they knew him still. Our families stay connected, even though we didn't know each other's faces. And the warm embrace to come back home, to come back into family, is a powerful act of decolonization as well. Is to say that, you know, the forces of assimilation tried to pull us apart, but there's something much, much stronger at work there that is at work in healing, and have faith in that.
Thank you so much, Robin. And thank you, Katie. So Robin, our next question is from Patricia Brandt. And this is kind of in reference to we had an earlier program that was focused on youth, specifically elementary and middle school students. That was amazing this afternoon. But Patricia wants to know, you know, how do we entice elementary school teachers to include themes highlighted within Braiding Sweetgrass?
That's a really interesting question of how does one entice. I guess what I would want to say is that I've been so surprised by the breadth of audiences that have engaged with Braiding Sweetgrass. Audiences that I never would have anticipated. And maybe there is the answer to your question. It's story. It's story that creates the invitation, I think, to engage with these ideas. As a writer, you know that I can get preachy real fast and start saying, this is the way it ought to be. Who wants to listen to that? Nobody. But everybody wants to listen to a story. And a story is an invitation, not to tell you what's what, but to invite you to try to look at the world differently and see what fits and feels whole to you. So I think it's the power of story and imagination and wonder that create the invitation to these ideas.
Thank you so much, Robin. I really like that. The story is an invitation. So our next question is from Tiana Casey. And Tiana wants to know, how would you, Robin, advise aspiring Indigenous professionals in the field of traditional ecological knowledge who feel discouraged to share their expertise and connection to the land?
There are so many forces out there that discourage us because we are, for the most part, working in that fortress, right? In that fortress model. And it's really discouraging because you feel those forces of erasure, of dismissal, as if our knowledge is not welcome there. The way that I've tried to navigate this in my own world, and this isn't because it's the only right way or even the right way. All I can do is share my own experience, is to try to meet my colleagues where they are, with all of their skepticism, with all of their ignorance, and recognize that many times their dismissal or attempted erasure of our ways is growing out of ignorance, and they need to be educated. So you meet them where they are and educate them as to what's missing. One of the things that has really worked for me is to try to express that Western scientific ways of knowing are simply a subset of Indigenous ways of knowing. To say, yes, your ways of knowing have power and validity, but there's so much more. And our knowledge would be more powerful and more complete when we use all of our human ways of knowing and the knowledge of people who have generated this knowledge on the land since time immemorial. So that's the approach that I've tried to take, is to endlessly be an educator. And I won't say tirelessly being an educator, because sometimes you do get tired. And sometimes people aren't willing to listen. But when I think about how this intellectual landscape was for me when I began all those years ago, the doors have opened. They're not open real wide yet, but they're open and we're ready to walk through.
Thank you so much, Robin. And thank you, Tiana, for submitting such a wonderful question. So our next question, Robin, is from Anna Lee. And Anna asked, do you have hopes in where we move forward in regards to natural resources and how we treat the natural world? And then a secondary question, are you optimistic or generally pessimistic about where we're headed?
I am by nature an optimistic person. So I guess I would say that I have what we would, without getting it into semantics, I suppose, I have hope. And the reason that I have hope is because of our capacity to change. I think that, of course, we are in serious, painfully serious times of degradation, of loss, but I think this is a time of transformation. This painful time of suffering was foretold by our ancestors and said that this would be a time of choice making and of transformation, that if we can go back and pick up the knowledge that our ancestors left for us, we can carry it into the future and make the future from it. In this time of great narrowing, what gives me hope is that notion that each of us looks around and says, what do we love too much to lose? Not what am I afraid of, but what do I love? What do I love too much to lose? And I will pick that up and carry it into the future. And that's the only way we'll have a future. But my hope and my trust is in that love that we have for the world, that each of us will pick up that piece and carry it like a seed into the future. Seeds give me hope.
Yes, me too. Thank you, Robin. And thank you, Anna. So our next question is from another Anna Yoakum. And Anna asked, how do you acknowledge and give back to the beings around you, Robin?
You know, the answer that comes immediately is joy. That when beings are showering me with gift, my response has to be of joyful gratitude. Like, wow, I can't believe there are berries in the world. I cannot believe that the sun comes up with bird song. I can't believe there's maple syrup. Are you kidding me? This joy and appreciation. But that has to be coupled with material responsibility as well. To give that joyful gratitude and then couple it to action. It might be direct action, like nurturing those plants or that forest, but it could be indirect action, like being part of a land trust that saves habitats for all those beloved beings to be. I give back by voting. I give back by telling stories. I give back by teaching, by teaching my grandchildren and my children. It's this notion again of an educated person knows how to give their gift back in the world. And to me, that's how we acknowledge and reciprocate, is to say, what is my gift? And in return for everything that I've been given, I'm going to give it with fury.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Robin. So our next question is coming from Patu Pitt. And Patu asked, Robin, how do you continue to recruit and support tribal citizens not traditionally served by academia or in settings that you influence?
I'm trying to think about all the dimensions of your question, because I believe so strongly in the power of Indigenous knowledge to transform the road ahead for us, because I believe in the responsibility that we have to our ancestors and to our descendants, I feel really committed to broaden access for participation for Native students in the sustainability sphere, I guess I'd say. Maybe in sciences, but in policy and in law and in arts, in all of the ways that our knowledge, which has been, many forces have tried to erase, is still here, because our ancestors said, and you've probably heard this too, that the reason that we have held on to our knowledge against all odds is there would come a time when all life needed our knowledge. And Native students who have been for so long excluded from these fields are carriers of that knowledge. This is our legacy. We so need one another to transform the path ahead. And so our work is both to indigenize the curriculum within the university so that there is a place where our knowledge is respected and taught in the university, and to create pathways through working in partnership with tribal colleges, for example, who I think are just amazing leadership institutions, to work in partnership with them. I also want to say that the university is not the only pathway forward for bringing Indigenous knowledge into the world. We have it in our communities. We serve our own people, and other communities of our choice. But if university education is a pathway that is desirable for Indigenous students, I want to make that a welcoming and nurturing place where our knowledge can transform and decolonize the structures that are around us. It's a lofty goal, and each of us can only do this much, but we're many and we're powerful.
Yes, thank you, Robin. I think that's a great question and a great answer. I think we've seen historically these opportunities are few and far between, and there's so many other ways to both serve the land and serve your community, and gain experience. And so thank you. So our next question is from Patricia Whitefoot. And Patricia asked, what is the role of students and educators? And can you please clarify?
What is the role of students and educators? I think we are united in a respect for knowledge, but I would say the role, there's lots of ways to interpret it, but the way I'm going to interpret it, I guess, is through that lens of having been told that knowledge is powerful only when it's shared. And that through the enterprise of education, being a student and being teachers and being in reciprocity between those things is a powerful way of sharing knowledge and learning from each other. And it is that knowledge generation that can be a source of new ideas, of new ways of living, of new problem solving, expands our imagination of what might be.
Thank you, Robin. Yes, thank you. So moving on to our next question, which comes from Gladys Ruiz. And Gladys asked, Robin, what's inspiring you at this very moment?
I would say that what is inspiring me at this moment is the potential for transformation. Because when I think of in this moment, I'm thinking of the very hard moment that we are in right now, all of us. And in the suffering that collectively we are experiencing, I think the vulnerability that we are sharing at this point has the capacity to vastly increase our compassion for one another and a sense of interdependence with one another, to know that we are all connected and that we have to act out of that place, that it's not abstract anymore, right? You know, we are all interdependent. Our survival depends on it. And so it is in that particular moment that I feel inspired by the opportunity for transformation that comes from this suffering, that it's a time of great values clarification where we can say and identify and really put our finger on what it is that we really value. And they are the simple things of community and the forces of life which sustain us, and a sense of moral integrity. And it is from those places that I think we can grow and heal from this moment.
Great, thank you. Yes, it's certainly a lot of healing needs to happen and is hopefully in store. So Robin, we had an extra question that came through from one of the partners, and I think we have a little bit of time if you're cool with it.
Sure, I'll try.
This question seemingly references the first 82 pages of Braiding Sweetgrass. And this question is from Shireen Amini, and she's asking, or they're asking, you know, it may be worth elevating from an Indigenous perspective. Do they have permission to call this land home? And if so, how can they do that with most integrity at this time?
There is, I don't remember whether it's the 82 pages or not, but there is certainly an invitation and an exploration in Braiding Sweetgrass to this notion of becoming native to place. And I am guided by an elder, Henry Lickers, who spoke so forcefully about, he said, you know, the problem with colonization is that the colonizers still have one foot on the boat. They're acting like they're not really here, you know, that they're just going to be here and take what they can get and go somewhere else. Well, there isn't any somewhere else anymore. Um, when one commits to living on the land as if, back to that slide about what land means, becoming native to place is to set aside this notion of land as property, land as capital, land as what can we take from it, to land as the source of belonging. To think about land as sacred, as our teacher, as our healer, as our relatives. That's what I mean by becoming native to place, to live as if your ancestors were from here and live as if your grandchildren are going to grow up here. And the better language, and you'll notice that in that exploration in braiding sweetgrass, I moved from thinking about this language of indigenous to place or native to place to shifting that language to the language that we use for plants who come from someplace else and yet have fit into and benefit the ecosystem here. We call them naturalized. They are naturalized species, and they have come into balance with this ecosystem. And that would be my hope for colonizers, is to live here as if you too will become good ancestors of this place, that you too will build good soil in which a future for all of our children is possible.
This makes me think of the kind of the land acknowledgement as the rules of the land, of or how to interact in the land and maintaining that relationship. And I think, as you know, the colonial history has really not recognized that. Do you have hope, Robin, that things will change or shift, or there'll be a forced shift in the future?
The land's a good teacher. We can't keep doing what we're doing, and the land is going to teach us. The land is teaching us right now. So yes. And Gabe, I really honor the way that you think about land acknowledgement as a set of not only acknowledgement, but as rules, right? They're what, so many of our people call our instructions, right? Our original instructions of what it is to live with respect, reciprocity, reverence for the land. And there is a way in which that story too is an invitation for others to adopt that way of being. I think about my Haudenosaunee neighbors when they teach about the teachings of the great law of peace that they say is really symbolized by the white pine tree. And the teaching is that white pine stretches out what are called the 4 white roots of peace. And they stretch out in all directions to communicate to others that if you want to live according to these instructions, follow these roots back to the tree, to the center. It's an invitation to live by the original instructions.
Well, thank you, Robin. Katsiyayo, as we say in much of the Pacific Northwest. Thank you for your words and your time. I think I feel comfortable speaking on behalf of our large audience that we sadly have to say goodnight. And I realize, it's very late where you're calling in from. So I appreciate you taking this time and making space to share your beautiful words with us. And I would, just compel our audience to really take this as a call to action. As Robin said, she's not sharing anything that we don't already know. It's just, have we chose to listen? So I would encourage folks to move forward, supporting each other, supporting the organizations that are involved with projects like these, and to really, convey and put Robin's words around reciprocity and responsibility into action, and don't leave this here. So just a logistical reminder, this talk will be recorded and shared via YouTube. And from this, I would just say, thank you again, Robin, Katsiyayo, and thank you everybody for joining. Have a good night.
Katsiyayo.